I want to wind up our discussion of international organizations and transnational actors of all sorts by distinguishing three different ways in which international cooperation operates. And so this is going to sound a little bit like a very complicated vocabulary lesson, but behind the vocabulary are these three distinct modes of interaction, which we would call transnationalism, intergovernmentalism, and supranationalism. And this is particularly relevant as it relates to the European Union, but also when we think about how the European Union is different than some other international organizations or non-governmental organizations. So I'm just going to go through these. So transnational is interaction that happens across borders, but in which the actors are not states. And so this involves a very broad range of actors, right? Companies, TNCs we've already talked about, transnational advocacy networks we've talked about, religious organizations, you think about the Catholic Church or other global religious organizations, media that operate across borders, football supporters groups, all you Liverpool fans out there besides me, and lots of others, right? And they can produce a variety of direct or indirect pressures on governments, right? But they don't consist of governments themselves. And we have intergovernmental activity, which is the interactions above and between governments, or a different way of putting it, right? This is really the bread and butter of international organizations. It's negotiations, and then it's the implementation of agreements between states. And so a key point in intergovernmental work is that governments are only obligated to what they specifically agree to. And so examples of this are all of the international organizations we're familiar with. NATO, the UN or the UN Security Council, the ad hoc group that does negotiations with Iran known as the P5+1. That's the permanent 5 members of the Security Council plus the European Union. But these are governments interacting with governments and making specific commitments to one another. So this is all pretty straightforward so far. When we get in particular into the European Union, we get something else again, which is called supranationalism. And in supranationalism, what's actually happening is rather than governments just coming to agreements themselves, they're actually delegating authority to an international organization, in this case the European Union, to make decisions. Right? So the classic example is the European Union, where in addition to agreements among the states, there's a whole bunch of areas, a lot of economic regulations, a lot of migration regulations. They don't get negotiated between the European states anymore. They get debated and discussed, and the decisions are made in Brussels by the organs of the European Union. Right? So we can sort of think of supranationalism in the European Union as roughly analogous to federalism within the United States, which is some decisions in the United States are still reserved for states or for localities, right? But a lot of decisions are made by government in Washington, D.C., such as it is. And so in the European Union as well now, there's actually something that starts to look like a federal government in the European Union now. But other examples are the International Criminal Court. For states that have joined that treaty and acceded to membership, which the United States has not, they're basically saying, yeah, we're delegating to you certain rights, not total rights, but certain authority to determine when international crimes have been committed and to actually try to prosecute those crimes. A third example is the World Trade Organization, which we'll talk about when we talk about free trade. But determining that the agreement has been violated is now the jurisdiction of a specific WTO dispute resolution. And that was an important development when the WTO was created in 1994. So all of this dramatically reduces the time and the cost of managing complex issues. The cost is you've got to surrender some of your sovereignty. You've got to say, okay, we're going to let the folks in Brussels sort this out. And of course, that's pretty controversial when it comes to things like Brexit, right? That's one of the big reasons for Brexit. So one of the key questions for the future is, will we see more or less supranationalism? On the one hand, the most recent administration in the United States, the Trump administration, really focused on pulling the United States back from a lot of international agreements. Brexit has led the British to leave the EU because they didn't like supranationalism. So in that respect, it seems to have taken a hit. At the same time, there are problems out there like the COVID pandemic or the economic problems that go along with it that in some respects are pushing states in the other direction to say, we've got to delegate more responsibility to organizations that can actually address these problems. And so that's where we'll leave it for now. But this is a big question for the future. And I don't think we're going to see it going all in one direction, right? In some places, we might see more supranationalism. In some other areas, we may see less.